We're delighted to welcome Vivien Schmidt here at the EUI today, who's going to give a lecture on the rhetoric of discontent and on the rise of populism later on. And today in this interview I would like to talk about some other aspects with you, bridging from your earlier work to what you're doing now and then to the current crisis in Europe. So my first question is, how did you become interested in discursive institutionalism?
Okay, so discursive institutionalism is a term I came up with in the 1990s. This is the mid-1990s when you ended up with the methodological wars, where you had three kinds of institutionalisms: rational choice, historical, and sociological institutionalism. And the one focused on interests, the other institutions, the other culture, institutions, path dependency, and the culture and framing. And they were all very static, and none dealt with ideas and discourse, i.e. it didn't deal with what people were thinking, saying, and who was talking to whom about what and where. And I thought in my own work, I always use a pluralism of methods. So I was focusing on interests, I was looking at issues of culture and institutions, but there was no room for me. So I ended up coming up with what I called discursive institutionalism as a way of legitimating an approach that also takes ideas and discourse seriously.
So, and in your current book, you're also using this approach, but you're also adapting it more to the Eurozone crisis nowadays. So what are the main findings that you are having and the main points that you're addressing there?
So, in looking at the Eurozone crisis, I've been, of course, as most people, the minute it started in 2010, I was focused on it. And I was interested in both the political economics of it, the politics of it, and also the governance procedures. Yes. And what you have is a whole range of literatures that look at either the political economy or the politics or the governance. And what I wanted to do is find a way in to pull it all together, but also to ask about the discursive institutionalist aspects, and in particular questions of legitimacy. Because once we think about who are these people, it's not simply that they're rational agents acting in their own interests, or not simply framed by culture, although many are, especially if we think about ordo-liberalism for the Germans. And it's also not just about rules and path-dependent institutions. These are sentient actors, thinking, saying, acting agents, who not only act, but also try to legitimate their actions.
Yeah.
So with discursive institutionalism, I use it as a bridge to be able to bring the empirics together with the more political, philosophical, and ethical questions under legitimacy. And for legitimacy itself, I then started looking at the literature, and there are two ways of considering legitimacy. One is legitimacy as governing authority, public consent, and the other is governing activities, legitimacy as governing activities that often, of course, feed into governing authority. And much of the EU studies literature looks at input and output legitimacy, meaning political legitimacy, or performance legitimacy. And in between, there are a whole range of criteria, principles, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, that were just floating out there. So I thought, we need to put them together, call it throughput, and there are other people who've used the term, not exactly in this way, and recognize that between input and output, there's throughput. There are governance procedures. So you can't just talk about political input, responsiveness of governments, for example, or citizens' representation or expression of their demands, and you can't only talk about policy effectiveness and performance. Although these are also questions of legitimacy, you also need to ask, what about the governance procedures? And in the book, what I do is I ask about how do we see the legitimacy in the legitimacy of actors in the Eurozone crisis in terms of their political economic performance, output, in terms of their governing responsiveness, input, and in terms of their quality, the quality of their governance processes, throughput, how accountable, how transparent, how inclusive, etc.
Okay, and when you're analyzing the throughput element, what do you identify as characteristics of the discourse inside of the institution?
Well, what was really interesting is, and this is sort of my fundamental argument in the book, what we saw first with throughput legitimacy is EU institutional actors said, okay, we assume that all we have to do, this is a stylized version of course, all we have to do is follow the rules, in fact reinforce the rules, and we'll have good policy performance, and therefore it doesn't matter that citizens were not involved. So this is what I call governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the Eurozone. And that you saw mainly in the first 2 years, 2010 to 2012. What we find subsequently is that all these EU institutional actors in one way or another, or at least most, recognize, they doubled down on the rules, followed the rules, but guess what? The performance wasn't working. The economics was failing, and you ended up with increasingly toxic politics, with the rise of populism, the rise of discontent, social movements, etc. And so there's a recognition on the part of EU institutional actors, there's a problem with the rules. Procedural legitimacy is not working. And so what I found is that you end up, all EU institutional actors in one way or another ended up reinterpreting the rules by stealth. It meant that they reinterpreted the rules, but for various reasons couldn't admit it. And the result is that although they got better policy performance as a result, there were still problems of legitimacy. Not only with the procedures, but also for the public. Because generally speaking, if you say, I'm reinforcing harsh austerity and structural reform, even as you give derogations to the rules, to the Italians, to the French, to the Spanish, ultimately the Spaniards will continue to feel oppressed, even when they're accommodated, and the Germans will feel deceived, regardless. And so that's the problem with legitimacy. And that essentially goes till 2015. And then subsequently there's an easing of the crisis, and also then the reinterpretation of the rules by stealth. And Juncker say, actually, we are engaged in flexibility, but we're going to create rules for flexibility, which may defeat the purpose. And certainly Mario Draghi, as head of the ECB, essentially, this was really interesting because he reinterpreted the rules, reinterpreted his mandate in plain view. So it was by stealth, but in plain view, because he said, he starts by saying, my mandate is here, credibility, and that followed Trichet, we're not a lender of last resort, to slowly but surely, by 2012, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro, and by 2015, he's doing quantitative easing, which is almost a lender of last resort. But each time there was a communicative discourse to the general public and signaling to EU actors, I'm within my mandate. But his mandate starts here, narrowly interpreted, and then it's reinterpreted successively to a very expansive notion of what it means to do EU monetary policy with quantitative easing, but it's all within his mandate. So we go from here all the way to there. For good reason, fortunately, but still problematic in terms of these are still suboptimal rules. Not only for the ECB, but in particular for the Commission and the European semester rules with the rules and numbers.
So now you're talking about suboptimal rules and also about policy performance. Could you explain a bit more the nexus between the two?
Okay. In fact, I should do the nexus between both the input part, politics, the procedures, and the performance. And what's interesting is that, generally speaking, people tend to assume people. EU institutional actors and others tend to assume that there is a kind of trade-off between input and output.
Yeah.
So that if the people have no say, but the results are good, everyone's happy. It's legitimate. Or alternatively, the people vote for something and approve something very stupid that doesn't work, it's still legitimate because the people voted for it, even though there's no performance legitimacy, if you will. So that's input-output. The problem with throughput is there's often an assumption, in particular by EU actors, that there's the same kind of trade-off. Okay, so if you have good throughput, then that will lead to good output, and you don't need input, or vice versa. And in fact, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Because throughput, however good you are in terms of your procedures, the best you are is you become invisible and make it possible for input to go directly to output without any problem. The problem, however, is that if you are incompetent, corrupt, oppressive, biased in terms of your judgments, in terms of the procedures, that can skew the input and taint the output. It becomes so you have corrupt. It's the constant argument of populists. Oh, these corrupt politicians. Well, that's about throughput legitimacy, and if you don't have that, it renders the legitimacy of the politics and the performance in question. And so so it's an interesting. So there's not the same kind of relationship, and the problem in the EU amongst, in particular, administrative actors is an assumption that, all we have to do is do a really good job, quality procedures, and everything will follow. Well, no. Not necessarily.
So, and building up on these findings and the problem with the throughput, how do you see the future of the European institutions? Also, when we account for the rise of populism nowadays.
Well, I'm going to try to be optimistic rather than pessimistic, because this, I think, is a pretty pessimistic moment in our history, given the rise of populism. We're here in Italy, we have a populist government. In France, right next door, we have the Gilets jaunes. Brexit is Brexiting, as it were, and we have Trump across the Atlantic. I think this is a highly problematic moment for the EU, but it's not unexpected, given the kinds of crises we've had, financial crisis, Eurozone crisis, migrant crisis, Brexit. So the question is, how does the EU respond? And what can we see for the future? And it's increasingly difficult for the EU to respond given the constraining consensus leading to a perhaps destructive dissensus, as some scholars argue. But the light at the end of the tunnel is two things. One, for the national level, the only way to combat populism is actually for institutions to work, for mainstream parties to actually start listening to the people, and providing and actually being responsive. This takes us back to the Eurozone crisis in particular, and the problems that economic crisis went on much too long and was not solved. And it's not simply because it was governing by rules and ruling by numbers, but because there were not proper solutions. Yes, there's banking union, but there are no euro bonds. And those countries that were in trouble ended up going through harsh austerity and structural reform, and are only now, in most cases, beginning to pull out of it. But Greece is still a problem, and Italy, well, let's not talk about Italy. So things need to be done at the national level to respond to these problems of populism that have a lot to do with the way in which mainstream parties need to take hold again. But at the EU level, you also need solutions. And the solutions can go in two directions. More integration, find a solution to the migrant crisis. Find some kind of agreement. And I would argue you need incentives. So rather than say for the migrant crisis, quotas, which gave Orban a beautiful populist appeal. No, we won't want quotas, we want borders, but quotas can't work. What you would need is a set of incentives, a set of various kinds of funds for refugee integration fund, for example, and a migrant adjustment fund, so that there are positive incentives for countries that are actually doing what they should be doing, not to suffer from it, and at the same time you're not punishing. I mean, I've said this elsewhere, if I were a refugee, the last place I would want to go to would be Hungary, given all of that. So you don't want to send people to places where they will not feel comfortable, nor do you want to cause problems in those countries either. So that's the national level. Rather, that's the EU level on the migrant crisis to solve it. In terms of the Eurozone crisis as well, there need to be appropriate EU-level instruments. There needs to be more redistribution at the EU level. The EU needs its own resources so that it doesn't look like you're taking from one country to give to another. And there are ways to do this, and many people have written about this. But beyond that, and this is a kind of positive note, I see politicization not only as a bad thing. So if we look at the EU now, what you see is politicization at the bottom, which is the rise of populism, the increasing polarization, not just right-left, but cosmopolitan versus communitarian or whatever. There are lots of terms that people use. But there's not just politicization at the bottom, there's politicization from the bottom up, which is that all of this kind of polarization and increasingly populist politics at the national level finds its way up to the EU level, to the Council, and in the Council you see member state leaders bringing in national politics, making it much harder for decisions to be made. But there's also a politics that is exclusively at the top. There's a new political dynamics of interaction, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. On the bad side, the politics of interaction is one in which you have member state leaders in the Council accusing the Commission of overstepping its authority, etc. You have the European Parliament saying that the Council is to blame for whatever, and on like that. So the content of the politicization can be delegitimizing in sort of the substance of the ideas, or the substance of the discourse. But the actual process itself can be very positive, because these institutions are now actually doing what national institutions tend to do. Different national institutional actors, just as the EU, where you get increasing debate and deliberation and disagreement and contestation. But that's what representative democracy is all about. So sort of the silver lining for the EU is that at the EU level you're seeing increasing public debate, public discussion, public contestation of decisions, and then compromise. And that, of course, is the essence of representative democracy. So the EU is not a democracy in the traditional sense, although its member states are democracies, so that for the EU to no longer be hidden from view, but rather to be very present and to be reported in the newspapers, and for these debates to go on, is actually a very good thing. But regardless of whether we see the EU as a good thing or a bad thing, it is a thing. And it's here to stay. So, excuse me, I think the most important thing for the EU is to recognize that politics is there, and that it needs to do everything it can at the EU level to deepen integration in ways that make it possible to have good policy performance, output. At the same time, it needs to stop trying to make too many decisions at the EU level. And in particular in the case of the Eurozone, my argument is it actually needs to give back to national governments control over their economic policies. Because what we see now with the European semester is a hierarchical kind of relationship where basically, from the point of view of national citizens, they see the EU telling their governments what to do on budgets, even without the parliament being able to have any kind of say.
Yeah.
That is highly problematic.
Yeah.
And so, for me, you need to flip the European semester, meaning not get rid of it. There's an amazing institutional architecture of coordination that needs to remain. That's actually very helpful in terms of best practice, benchmarking, and all of that. But the recommendations and the decisions need to come from the bottom up. And similarly, instead of having fiscal councils or competitiveness councils that are seen as ways of keeping tabs on governments, are you being good, are you doing what your fiscal, these should become industrial policy councils, where made up of, in France in the 50s, think of the plan, the force vive de la nation. Basically, it should involve the social partners, and these should be industrial policy councils that actually think, okay, well, how can we solve the problems? How can we come back to growth? As opposed to constantly saying, oh, we have to focus on the stability rules. That hasn't gotten most countries anywhere. There needs investment for growth, but where do you invest? Only at the national level do people know where to do that. So, in fact, a lot of that's already happening, but the appearance is not that. It looks top down, but some of it's actually bottom up. But now, make it truly bottom up. And that will probably help also solve the populist problem, because these divisions, because if you give back to the national level control over their own economic policies, then you can have more differentiation between the right and the left again, and mainstream parties can then say, no, I want to do this, more austerity, because I'm on the right, or on the left, no, we want to do more demand-side policies because I'm on the left, and see who manages it. And allow the people to decide what kinds of economic policies they want for what kind of future, as opposed to seeing this as always coming down from the EU with, governing by rules and ruling by numbers that actually don't work.
Okay, then coming to my next point. When looking at Europe today, we might also say that there is a discursive gap between the national level and the EU level. Where would you say what are the most crucial points in this regard, and what are possibilities to bridge these gaps?
That's a very difficult question. I think one of the big problems is that who's talking for the EU? It's actually national leaders, member state leaders at the EU level, but who are national leaders. And they have no incentives to talk about the EU. If something good comes from the EU and they agree on something, they basically take credit for it. Oh, I did it. But if it's something that is not very popular, they'll say the EU made me do that. Blame the EU. So it's credit taking versus blame shifting. And that is highly problematic for the EU. There's no one really to speak for the EU. Well, I exaggerate slightly. But at the national level, it's national leaders speaking to national media. And so that's highly problematic. At the EU, what you do see is an increasing discourse, as with the politicization. You're hearing Donald Tusk, you're hearing Commission President Juncker more. And that's ultimately a good thing. But not enough.
Okay, that leads you to my last question. Not enough. So, if the politicians are not able to do enough, what do you think? What are the roles of an academic nowadays?
Well, to give interviews like this, of course. No, but it seems to me that for a long time, political scientists in particular said, no, we have to be objective. There's no normativity. And I think it's important to be objective, but it doesn't mean that one can't be engaged. Because everyone has some kind of a normative set of reasons for studying this or that topic. But I think we're at a moment in history where it's no longer possible to sit back. Yes, you want to do deep, basic science, if you will, and deep academic work, but I think we have an increasing obligation to translate this into terms that the more general public can understand. And to do it in ways that can lead to recommendations for various positive outcomes. I think the world has become, all of a sudden, it seems, a very dangerous place. And I think the role of academics is actually to try to engage more with their environment and to be much more actively engaged in thinking about how to solve some of these problems.
So thanks a lot for this interview.
Well, thank you.
And I'm looking forward to the lecture tonight.
Thank you very much. Okay. Imagine rolling.
Yeah, exactly. No, but that was, I mean, I was there to give you...
Yeah, you were
players.
doing a very good job of that.